Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Thursday afternoon and the video introduction to week number 6. Can you believe it? I can't, but on the other hand, it's kind of nice to be settled into the term and almost halfway through, really, in many ways. Next week's discussion is on methodologies. So I want to give you a little bit more clarification and details about what your initial post should contain. So what type of research that you want to be doing in the next few days and the initial post that you want to create. I also wanted to take this week down to a little bit of a more practical level in looking at methodologies. The 3 readings are fairly similar to each other, and you'll see that they're all reports on studies of methodologies used in LIS. So I haven't given you any general readings on what is a methodology or what is a method or how do these terms relate to each other. You can do a little bit of background research on that yourself if you would like. All 3 of the articles do contain definitions and explain how they've used those terms in order to conduct their study. But I want this to be a fairly hands-on practical assignment that culminates into your initial post. So let me just get started by a little bit of summary of the 3 articles that I've given you. As I said, they're all fairly similar in that they are examining research methods in LIS, and they're all recent as well. And you'll notice that when you look at their literature reviews that they do cite a number of older studies that looked at the same thing. So for some reason, we're kind of preoccupied with looking at how we do things. A little bit of navel gazing, I guess. And that's kind of interesting. But I think the results of these 3 studies are interesting, and it also gives you some ideas as to methodologies that you might wish to explore when you start looking for articles. I'll start with the Allah and Amin article, which is the most recent one, and they bill themselves as having one of the most comprehensive reviews of methodologies used in LIS research, and I think they sort of have. It's quite broad in scope, and they call it a systematic review, which is really like a scan of the entire literature. And what's interesting, when you look at all 3 of these studies, I want you to look at these things in particular. I want you to look at their methodology. So what did they use in order to conduct their study? And I want you to look at their findings. And within the findings, look at they all present charts and look at the terms that they use and how they define methodology. And then also look at the results and what they discovered about what are the most common methodologies or methods or research approaches in library and information sciences. I don't think that you'll be surprised by it, although I was a little bit surprised. As Allah and Amin discovered, the most common methods are empirical, descriptive, and quantitative research, with the emphasis on empirical studies. Survey is the most common method, and the analysis of surveys is typically quantitative in nature, not qualitative. And that doesn't really surprise me, but I'm maybe a little bit disappointed that there aren't more qualitative studies. But anyway, that's just my thing. They have a really good definition that they cite, Bickman and Rogge, and they say what a methodology is and that it serves as the architectural blueprint of a research project, and what it does is links data collection with analysis activities back to the research question and ensures that the complete research agenda will be addressed. So it's the approach that you take to research after you've defined your research question. I watched this one video that explained it really quite succinctly, and this is the proper way to use the terminology. All of these studies have mixed up those terms because they've looked at methods and methodology, and the reason for that, I believe, is because they stayed true to what the authors of the studies defined as their approaches to research. If an author only said, we did a focus group, or we did a bibliometric analysis, these researchers reported on that. So they really looked at methodologies and methods all together, lumped together, not just specific methodologies that they selected, but they looked at the whole gamut of the literature. So that's why you'll see a mixture of different terms that are presented. But anyway, this video that I had found at one time, and you can probably find it if you do a search methodology and methods on YouTube, is she described it as a mountain. And you know how a mountain has a certain amount of the mountain is below sea level or below the earth. And the part that you see on the top, the mountain part that we can visually see, is the methods. So those are the tools and techniques that you use in order to conduct your research, like an interview, like a focus group, like a questionnaire. The part that sort of underpins or is the thinking behind the methods is called the methodology. So what is our approach from a more theoretical point of view, and then what is our method? One example I have is a methodology that was used by a friend of mine, actually, who is a professor in occupational therapy at the University of Alberta. Her methodology for her PhD thesis several years ago was phenomenology, and that's the study of people's lived experiences. So what's a day in the life like for a particular individual? That was her methodology, and her method was observation. And so she followed alongside 3 individuals to see what the day was like in the lives of these 3 people. In my case, my study was a case study, so I looked at 3 bounded cases, which was public, academic, and special school libraries. See, I forget already what I studied. Public, academic, and school libraries, those were my cases. So it's a case study approach that looks at these bounded systems and does essentially a comparison of those 3, as well as draw conclusions from the entire population. And my methods were interviews. I was going to do observation, decided not to, that there wasn't a point to it, so I just did interviews. That just gives you an example of methodology and methods. Okay, moving on now. In the Allah and Amin study, I should have had these up here, if I can just pull it up here. In Allah and Amin's study, Table 6 gives a really nice list of methods and methodologies if you're looking for ideas. For the purposes of your initial post and discussion next week, I don't want you to be as concerned with, although you can certainly discuss the terminology, but if you wish to take from this list, you can. You can pick a method if you so wish. Although if you pick a method like interviews, you're going to be a little maybe overwhelmed, but I'll talk more at the end of the video about how I want you to pick. But this table gives methods and methodologies, so they've just used the terminology from the original researchers of this study. So if a researcher described their study as citation analysis, they just put that in. If they described it as an ethnography, which is more of a methodology, then they just put that in. So they just lumped everything as methods. Chu and Key is the other study, which is a year older. I noticed that Allah and Amin didn't cite Chu and Key. I think they cited an earlier work by Chu, but not that study because it was probably just in publication, and then they didn't get a chance to, to add it into theirs. But they use methods as the terminology to cover the entire research process. And I like how they refer to methods as being to data collection, and then qualitative and quantitative refers to data analysis. Because a survey, after all, which is a method, could contain quantitative and qualitative questions, right? They analyzed, theirs wasn't systematic, but it was quite a large study where they analyzed 1,981 research articles between 2001 and 2010. And in their study, they listed, on page 293, they listed methods that appeared in LIS literature during that time period. So if you wish to look at another list, go to Chu and Key, and go to page 293 of their study, and you will find a complete listing of their methods that they listed. Sorry, there it is right there. Table 7. Read the conclusion on this one, and because it's interesting what they discovered. All right, so the third article is the Togia article from 2017, so the same year as the Chu and Key article. And the difference in this article, whereas Chu's was quite large, an analysis of over almost 2,000 different articles, these guys picked 5 journals, 5 specific journals that had what they called the highest impact factor, so very reputable publications within library and information sciences. And in their article, page 53 has a really nice list of research methodologies that it lists. Let me just take you to that page here. There it is. And those look a bit more like methodologies as methodologies should be. You might find that useful because it also has a description then about like a definition of what each of those methodologies is, and a reference as well in some cases as to where you can go to look for more information. Page 54 is interesting because it has a list of the top research topics in library studies, and information retrieval looks like it's number 1. And you can go down the list and just see what the focus of the research studies have been. I was interested to see that library personnel is only at 3.6, which is quite low. So 3.6% of articles were on library personnel. So that can be used as a justification, for further study in a particular area, that there isn't a lot of investigation on particular topics. All right, so those are the readings. With the initial post, what I'd like you to do now, notwithstanding the description that I've given you, which is great, but you can do one of 2 things. You can investigate a particular methodology, so you can decide that you are interested in grounded theory, and then you can locate a couple of different studies that use that particular methodology, and then talk about how that methodology is effective in that particular study. So you're kind of doing 2 things in that. You're doing some research as to how different researchers might handle or might, how it might play out using that particular methodology. But you're also introducing that methodology to your discussion colleagues. So you're, probably providing a definition of grounded theory and an explanation of what it is, and then going on to discuss how grounded theory was used in those 2 articles, those 2 research cases. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing that you might choose to do is you can look at a particular topic, and then you can find a couple of articles that use 2 different types of methodologies to research that particular topic or approach methodological approaches to that particular topic. Now that might be a more useful and a more better use of your time, because you probably are formulating a topic idea in your head for the literature review. So while you're looking at articles, you could pick a couple that use different methodologies and do a bit of a comparison contrast of those 2 different styles or approaches to the research. So you can do either that you want to do. I did want to just use as an example looking at our emotional labor research, because that's kind of what I know best right now. So that's why I'm using it as an example. But if I wanted to look at 3 different studies of emotional labor and how emotional labor is approached, I see that there's one study, the emotional labor in librarianship, where there was a very large survey conducted. So if you look at just the abstract itself, it talks about data were collected from a sample of American librarians in 46 states who completed a survey. And then they go on to use quantitative terminology, which tells me that it is a quantitative study. So that was one approach to emotional labor. Let me just find my other ones here that I looked at. If I can find them here. Sorry about that. Oh, here it is. The other one was emotional labor in the academic library. Again, it's a study on the same topic, emotional labor in academic librarianship or in librarianship. And this one was a case study approach. If I read the abstract for this, it doesn't tell me too much about the methodology, so what I have to do is scroll down to the methodologies section after the literature review is finished. They have quite a lengthy, lovely literature review. And I guess I went too far. Sorry about that. I should really plan this out a little bit better, shouldn't I? But somewhere in here, it talks about how they collected the data. And I'm sorry, at the very moment I'm not locating. There it is. So what they did was they did a case study approach. They looked at one academic library, and it looks like they interviewed 7 librarians. So they conducted interviews with 6 that agreed to be interviewed. So completely different type of study, different topic, completely different approach to the study. Way more qualitative in nature, and it's just a case study, a bounded case of one academic library. The third one is called Emotional Labor in Librarians' Instructional Work. And this one, if you look, I love how this particular journal arranges the abstract because it's very easy to read. And they have a design methodology section, and it says data collected from qualitative interviews with library staff and diary entries written over a 3-month period, and then analyzed using in vivo software, that's a qualitative software tool, and an open coding grounded theory approach. So what they did, and it was influenced by a phenomenological perspective, blah, blah, blah. So very theoretical, they're very careful with their terminology in this particular study. Not surprising because they are professors at the U of A, or Heidi Julian used to be. She's down in Buffalo now, I think. And so they've taken a grounded theory approach. I think it's really interesting to look at these 3 studies and to look at how each of these 3 sets of researchers have approached the same general topic and how they've collected the data and what that data means, what it represents, and what sort of conclusions that they come to and how they frame those conclusions. So that's an example of 3. I'm just requiring you to grab 2 where you can either go in by topic, or you can go in by methodology, your choice. I'll leave that open for you to choose that direction. But don't get too deep into the terminologies or too deep into the, don't limit your discussion to battles of what is methods and what is methodologies. Maybe try to make sense of it within the context of what you're looking at and the discrepancies that you might see in your own observation. But I would like the discussion to be a little bit broader than that in looking at how we can approach research topics in a variety of ways and what that means to the end result of the research, and also becoming more familiar with some of the methodologies that are used in library and information sciences. I think both of those are valuable pieces of of the puzzle in understanding this research world that we're in. Anyway, so best of luck with you. Enjoy the next few days of your readings, and I really look forward to reading your discussion post next week. Let me know if you have any questions at all. I am happy to answer them, okay? So enjoy the rest of today and the rest of Friday and your weekends as well. Thanks very much for listening.